We've been on hiatus for the last 6 weeks. When we went on our break in late June, we were hoping to see college football played this year. Just the last week, the Big Ten and the Pac-12 postponed their season till the spring, hoping to maybe start in January. Ryan Day just said maybe we can start playing 8 games starting in January. Justin Fields, the quarterback of the Ohio State, starting a petition, however, to get the Big Ten back on the field. And parents of the Michigan Wolverine football team created a Twitter account just today to put out a statement saying that they want to sit down with the Big Ten commissioner and also the president of the school to start saying, hey, what did you base this stuff on? While the SEC, ACC, and Big 12 are still considering playing football this year. So there's a lot of stuff all over the map, literally and figuratively. And I saw this gentleman was on CNN over the weekend, and it was reported just in a couple of written spots. I did not really get to see the interview, so I just definitely wanted to chat with him myself, and I'm appreciative of him calling into the show. He is the Chief Medical Officer of the NCAA, Dr. Brian Hainline. How are you, Doc?
Well, I'm doing well. How are you, Rich?
I am doing well. So let's, I guess, jump right in here. Where do you stand on the issue of whether football should be played collegiately this fall, Dr. Hainline?
So, Rich, I stand in the same place as the advisory panel that we put together and actually 3 other medical groups, which include the Power 5 or Autonomy 5 medical advisory panel. We didn't weigh in and say play or don't play fall sports. We said these are the rigid conditions under which they must be played. And we actually included 5 reasons not to play fall sports. And so the Big Ten and then separately the Pac-12, they looked at all of that and they made their own independent decision that they didn't think they could meet those criteria. And the SEC, ACC, and Big 12, they postponed making a decision. And they said, maybe something will shift and we can meet those criteria. So that's where we are. It wasn't an NCAA top-down decision. It was an NCAA saying, these are the absolute conditions, and these are conference decisions.
Well, I guess part of the concerns of those who are petitioning the Big Ten and Justin Fields to play, and parents of Michigan, just to name just a couple of entities and people that want to play, is that when you say conditions and the conversation that you have put together, or at least the science that you put together, of not to play, that it seems to be not very well known. So what are those conditions that are out there that the Big Ten heard and the Pac-12 heard and decided to move on from football and fall sports right now?
Well, so there are a few things. One is that there has to be a testing program in place, and the minimum amount of time to get a test back, it has to be 3 days or less. And frankly, in most parts of the country right now, it's taking 7 to 10 days to get a test result back. So that in and of itself is a national disaster and shouldn't be the case. The other is that you have to be able to look at where you are locally in terms of your hospital infrastructure. That's one other example. And if they're at a situation where they are close to imploding or are very filled, that's a reason not to be able to proceed. Another is that you have to have the ability to do absolutely good contact tracing. And in the majority of this country right now, we aren't even close to being able to do contact tracing. We can barely even find out, the 2 close contacts, let alone the 10 close contacts. And then another is you have to be able to be certain that you can fairly isolate and quarantine all individuals that have to be in that situation. And your infection rate has to be at a place that the local public health officials say, yeah, this infection rate is acceptable. And what's interesting in our country is that we don't have any national guidance. That's making it quite difficult. And in some parts of the country, the local health officials say, look, this infection rate is not acceptable. We can't be doing much of anything. And in other parts, they have a different interpretation. So, with a new pandemic, a new disease, you have people looking at the same science, but they interpret it somewhat differently. And that's actually been the case when we look at a lot of disease states in our country. It's not just a black and white, the scientists say this, it's also how we interpret what the scientists are saying.
So, Dr. Brian Hainline, the NCAA Chief Medical Officer here on the Rich Eisen Show. A lot of those criteria that you mentioned, though, it does seem that a Power 5 big-time school would be able to get the testing and get and have the health care at their ready. Now, not every school can, but some of the schools that have been canceled that want to play might be hearing this from you, Doc, and saying, you know, we could actually do that, or we were actually doing that. Is there anything else that was put on the table that caused schools to essentially tap out on football?
Well, no, it really was, we have to also look at who's making the decisions ultimately.
Yes.
And it's the presidents of the universities. And so the Ivy League presidents, for example, before anyone else, they said, look, this just doesn't look like we're going to be able to reasonably pull this off. And it has less to do just with football as it has to do with these are football athletes that are going to be interacting with a large student body. And we have no idea if we're going to be able to keep this virus contained even within the student body, let alone with the football team. I mean, they control the football team for 4 hours a day, but then there is 20 hours a day where things are quite variable. And that's the great difficulty with this pandemic. I mean, quite honestly, when we started thinking about fall sports, we really thought we were going to be in a radically different place than we are today. We had all of the projections going in the right place, and then what happened is our country just moved in completely the wrong direction, and I think the presidents are responding to that as well.
And so the testing as it currently is right now in the SEC, ACC, and Big 12, do you think satisfactory for them to eventually decide to play?
Not if it was today. There's no way anyone could if we were to play today. The very interesting thing, and I've been saying this all along, I don't think that the traditional, what we call PCR tests, so where you do the nasal or nasopharyngeal swab, you send it to a lab. I mean, we're running short of reagent in this country, and that test is taking a very long time. And in some parts of the country, it's on a priority basis, meaning that only the sick are tested. So then it's unethical to do testing in that situation. I think that what the other conferences may be holding off for is that a different type of test is going to emerge. And indeed, we saw this weekend that a new saliva direct test has come about. So this is something that the NBA was testing alongside their traditional tests, and they said, hey, the results are not perfect, but they're pretty good. And I think some other of what we call point-of-care tests, meaning you get the results back immediately, you aren't using scarce resources and other labs, I think those are going to emerge. And so if they really do emerge and they become widespread and they're available, well, that's a paradigm shift. It's a real paradigm shift.
Dr. Brian Hainline, the Chief Medical Officer of the NCAA, joining me right here on the Rich Eisen Show. And that testing is something I definitely want to dig into a little bit deeper. But if you just hang on 1 second, I do want to tell all the audience here on NBCSN that I'm sending you to NHL Live with Catherine Tappan right now. Enjoy the first of 4 NHL hockey playoff games right here on NBCSN. And I'm staying on the line with Dr. Hainline for the moment here. So when you're talking about the testing and you're saying that these other leagues are hoping that the testing could potentially be satisfactory, do you think it's possible that the Big Ten and the Pac-12, under those circumstances, might open up again? Is that something that you're thinking is feasible?
Well, I can't really speak for them, but there's a very interesting dynamic, as you mentioned in the opening, about parents and players wanting to be part of the decision making as well. And so, look, these are dynamic situations we haven't encountered in over 100 years when it comes to a very virulent and quite infectious disease. So that could be a consideration. And the other is, well, what happens when they open up their schools? I mean, they have to decide if that's going well, too, because I also mentioned the other night that when we really start opening up schools, we may find that that's going so poorly that we really can't consider much of anything, let alone sports. So, but going back to your question about the testing, yeah, I think if they reopen the conversation, and again, that's their conversation to have, and the testing paradigm has shifted that radically, yeah, that's a real game changer.
Now, another thing that we've heard in reporting, Dr. Hainline, is that the conversation and the topic of myocarditis, if I'm pronouncing that correct,
Yes.
that the issue involving the heart and the inflammation of the heart muscles, that it can hit anybody due to COVID-19. We're seeing what Eduardo Rodriguez, right, Chris, of the Boston Red Sox.
Correct.
He is suffering from it.
He is.
Member of the Indiana football team, I think a freshman on the Indiana football team is dealing with it. What can you tell fans about this? Because we're hearing so much about this, and apparently this was the, if you will, sealer, the game-changing sealer of the decision for the Big Ten and Pac-12 commissioners to make their decision.
Well, so we've known about the possibility of myocarditis really for more than 2 months, close to 2.5 months, and we've been talking about it. And now there are about a dozen case reports of college athletes who have developed this. So going back, I can tell you I've been in sports medicine a while. Even 30 years ago, I remember speaking at a tennis conference for elite tennis players, and there were a group of scientists saying that if you have any symptomatic viral syndrome, you should not be working out because there's a chance of a myocarditis with any virus. But it just so happens that in this particular coronavirus, that for COVID-19, that the myocarditis is probably more severe. But we also worked with a group of cardiologists from the American College of Cardiology and the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, and we developed a protocol for evaluating this. And so essentially, any athlete who has had COVID-19 undergoes a 3-part evaluation, and so that's an expense. It's an added expense, but you can actually assess for myocarditis, and of course, if you have it, then the athlete sits out. And if you don't, well, then the athlete is clear. So this is what the professional sports have been doing, and we've also developed a similar protocol. So, yes, it's a complication, and it can be assessed for.
And so today, the SEC is going to start training, and it's not just football, too, this fall, Doctor. It's, Midnight Madness is just about, 6 weeks around the corner. Usually middle of October is when college basketball programs begin to get back. What's the improvement in testing we need to see? That is there a problem even with you advocating for the start of college basketball here?
Well, I think college basketball is an entirely separate conversation, and the one thing that makes basketball different from football is the frequency of the games, and so it's not so much just the practice; it's really when you're playing against another team. So you may do everything right. You have a semi permeable bubble, and you don't want some other team coming in and all of a sudden infecting your team. So basketball, that makes it even more challenging because there are so many games. And so for basketball to proceed, there definitely would have to be a real shift in testing. But we can see that we're moving in that direction. So I would just say that there's a real sense of optimism and the ability to do diagnostic testing and get the results within a day.
Okay.
We just aren't there today. That's the problem.
So what based on your knowledge and being, I imagine, at the cutting edge of this, in the forefront, and your phone, I talked to Dr. Alan Sills of the NFL, and his phone rings like crazy when it comes to people saying, I got this test, I got that test. Your phone must be ringing crazy too. So what can you tell people about what you know about testing therapeutics and how this can actually begin to change your belief on whether sports can actually exist in our society currently?
Well, and I don't think it's even for sports. I think, so you probably have read recently about the paper test. And so, before you go on an airplane, before you go on a restaurant, until we have a vaccine, if you can get a rapid test and you say, hey, you want to come into my restaurant? We're going to test you right now. This is what we probably are going to need to do as a society until we really are certain that we have an effective treatment or a vaccine. And most of us who have really been in the trenches and working with all these individuals, we think that this is going to emerge by the fall. So we already have the saliva direct test that was approved by the FDA that the NBA helped to sponsor with their research. So that's going to be available in the next several weeks. We have antigen tests that are definitely going to be available in the fall, and there we can get up to 50 tests in an hour. So it's all happening. It's just that if someone were to say, should we be playing competitive sports today based on where we are? Well, maybe we can train, but we shouldn't be playing games today because the testing is still, quite frankly, it's more archaic. When you really think about it, in our country and the most developed country in the world, that we're waiting 10 days to get a test, it's just exceptionally disappointing, to say the least.
I agree with you, Dr. Hainline. Just a couple minutes left with you. I want to ask you point blank, do you think there's going to be college football in the FCC, Big 12, and ACC this fall? Do you think that?
Oh, boy. Well, look, I think there is that possibility. We've always said, or at least, Dr. Emmert and the president of the NCAA and myself, yeah, it's possible. It's an exceptionally narrow path. And there's treacherous waters on either side of that narrow path. But if everything aligned perfectly, it is a possibility.
Well, you mentioned Dr. Emmert, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond. I'm sure you might have heard the criticism that the NCAA has received in the last week to 10 days on this subject alone. That in the same way that you say that there's no national strategy on testing and battling this virus writ large, many people would say that's the same thing that's going on right now in college athletics, Dr. Hainline, that right now you're just letting all the localities and municipalities and states figure it out for themselves and not come down from the top down and say there is no football, there is no sports because of X, Y, and Z. How do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, and I think it's a very fair question. And what is not appreciated really behind the scenes is that when we put out our last document, which actually is a mandate, so every school must follow it, and within that mandate, every athlete has the right to opt out of sport, and he still or she maintains their scholarship and their eligibility. It wasn't just the NCAA that put this document out. It actually was endorsed by the National Medical Association, our advisory panel, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, the Power 5 Medical Advisory Panel, and the Committee on Competitive Safeguards. And so you have this very, very large group of experts. They all weighed in and said, the decision is not whether to play fall sports or not. The decision is this is what must take place to play these fall sports. And so with that in mind and looking at the wide variability across our country, we made the collective decision that that really is a conference-by-conference decision. They know what they must follow, except when it comes to national championships. And so we did make the decision on national championships. Regrettably, we had to decide to cancel all the fall championships. But I think everyone knows, or most everyone knows, that we control 90 championships. There's one that we don't control, and that's the college football playoff. What we do control in the college football playoff is what the student athletes must undergo, and so the mandates are for the student athletes' health and safety, so they must be followed. But ultimately, just because of historical quirks, the college football playoff is also decided by the conferences.
Dr. Hainline, I really appreciate the time, and so many fans just want to know that. Again, it just seems that maybe a document of exactly what you laid out for all of these conferences medically and the science and protocols, again, just putting it all out there and saying this is what we have told all the conferences, and maybe that is necessary. Would you?
Oh, absolutely, and we actually have put that out there,
okay.
And so anyone can access it. It's ncaa.org/SSI.
Okay.
And this document is there along with the frequently asked questions. And so we put a wide release out there. Sometimes it
takes a
doesn't
while.
hit everyone.
Well, hey, look, I've been on hiatus. Maybe that's where I missed it. But again, it just to see, parents sending, creating Twitter addresses to say, hey, Kevin Warren, hey, Dr. Schlissel, we need to meet. You need to tell us what you've been told. And you're saying this document is there for everybody to be aware of what the president of Michigan and the Big Ten commissioner have been told.
It's there, and actually it's the third document that we put out in this series, and actually for the last 20 weeks we've been discussing this on what's called a social series weekly, so that everyone can hear our thought processes. But sometimes it takes a crisis for everyone to then say, hell yeah, that's where it is, or now I find it, because everyone's busy doing other things or what have you. But we really have tried our best to socialize this and make it widely available to everyone. And I love the feedback, when people read it, because look, we're all trying to figure this out. It's almost like one day at a time.
I bet. Thanks for the call. Appreciate it. And look for my call again. I've definitely, obviously this is going to be changing and hopefully for the better. And we can get you back on.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity.
You bet. You got it. Thank you.
Right.
That's
Okay.
Dr. Brian Hainline, the Chief Medical Officer of the NCAA.